Imagine a world where your survival depended entirely on the whims of nature. In the Middle Ages, weather was not just an inconvenience. It was a matter of life and death. Without modern technology, people had to rely on their wits, experience, and sheer resilience to navigate the harsh realities of droughts, floods, and extreme temperatures. This segment will explore how medieval communities coped with these challenges, highlighting the ingenuity and desperation that defined their daily lives. In the Middle Ages, the weather was unpredictable and unforgiving. Farmers, who made up the majority of the population, lived at the mercy of rain or sun. A single dry season could wipe out entire harvests, leaving families without food for months. Conversely, heavy rains could flood fields, washing away crops and destroying homes. These extremes were not just natural disasters. They were constant reminders of humanity's vulnerability. Weather patterns dictated everything from economic stability to social order. Droughts led to famine, which often resulted in widespread poverty, disease, and even rebellion. Floods, on the other hand, destroyed infrastructure and forced communities to rebuild from scratch. Yet, despite these hardships, medieval people found ways to adapt, innovate, and survive. In this video, we'll delve into the specific strategies used by medieval societies to cope with droughts and floods. From water management techniques to agricultural innovations, we'll uncover how these communities turned adversity into opportunity. But first, let's understand the scale of the problem. How did medieval people perceive and respond to the weather? Imagine a world where the sky turned into a relentless furnace, and the earth cracked like broken glass beneath your feet. This was the reality of drought in the Middle Ages, a silent but deadly force that could wipe out entire harvests and bring communities to their knees. In an age without modern irrigation or weather forecasting, farmers were utterly dependent on the rain. A single dry season could spell disaster. Crops withered under the unrelenting sun, livestock grew weak from lack of water and pasture, and food supplies dwindled dangerously. The once fertile fields became dust bowls, and the air carried the smell of desperation. Drought wasn't just about empty stomachs. It was about collapsing economies. With no grain to sell or trade, merchants had nothing to offer, and townspeople found themselves bartering for scraps. Starvation loomed over every village, and the poor bore the brunt of nature's wrath. Desperate families would travel for miles in search of food, only to find others in the same condition, all fighting for survival. Wells ran dry, rivers shrank to trickles, and even the most basic hygiene became impossible. Without clean water, disease spread rapidly. Illnesses that might have been manageable under normal conditions now became death sentences. In some regions, people resorted to drinking wine or vinegar diluted with water, hoping it would keep them alive longer than pure water ever could. And yet, medieval society did not simply collapse under these conditions. People adapted. Priests led processions to pray for rain. Farmers tried ancient techniques to conserve what little moisture remained in the soil. Communities rationed food and shared resources, often at great personal cost. But understanding drought in the Middle Ages means understanding more than just the physical effects. It means understanding fear, faith, and the fragile thread on which survival hung. Drought was more than just dry ground. It was a slow, creeping disaster that drained life from the land and hope from the people. But medieval societies didn't simply wait to starve or die of thirst. They fought back with ingenuity, tradition, and sometimes desperation. One of the first lines of defense was water conservation. Villages built cisterns and rain catchments to store what little rain they could collect. These structures were often lined with clay or plaster to prevent seepage, and communities guarded them fiercely. In some regions, such as parts of France and Germany, underground reservoirs were carved into hillsides, keeping water cool and protected from evaporation. Farmers adapted their techniques to stretch every drop. Deep plowing helped trap moisture beneath the soil, while mulching with straw or leaves reduced surface evaporation. Crop rotation was not yet widespread, but many farmers experimented with alternating between grains and legumes to preserve nutrients and soil moisture. In times of extreme drought, desperate measures became common. Some communities turned to cloudburst rituals, public ceremonies led by priests or local leaders who prayed for divine intervention. Rain dances, processions, and even mass pilgrimages were organized in hopes of appeasing God or the heavens. In some cases, People believed drought was punishment for sin, leading to self-flagellation movements or witch hunts, where someone had to be blamed for the catastrophe. Another survival tactic was migration. When crops failed year after year, entire families packed up what little they had and moved in search of better conditions. This often led to overcrowding in neighboring towns, straining already limited resources and sparking conflict. In larger kingdoms, rulers sometimes issued decrees allowing displaced peasants to settle on unused lands, though enforcement was inconsistent. Grain reserves also played a critical role. Wealthy lords and monasteries stored surplus grain in fortified granaries, releasing it during times of crisis. While this helped stabilize food prices, it also gave those in power immense leverage over starving populations. Some used this to feed the poor, while others exploited the situation, raising prices to unbearable levels. Despite all these efforts, drought remained one of the most feared threats of the medieval world. It didn't announce itself with thunder or fire. It crept in silently, turning fields to dust and bodies to bone. And when the rains finally returned, the scars left behind lasted for generations. When drought struck in the Middle Ages, it didn't just dry up crops. It cracked the very foundation of society. Without food, hunger turned into starvation. With starvation came disease. And with disease came death. But before people died, they fought for bread, for water, for survival. Drought wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a catalyst for chaos. As grain supplies dwindled, prices skyrocketed. A loaf of bread that once cost a single penny could suddenly cost 10. For peasants who earned barely enough to survive in good times, this was a death sentence. Starving families rioted in the streets, looting granaries and attacking merchants. In some cities, guards were stationed at bakeries to prevent mobs from tearing them apart. The rich fared better, but not by much. Lords and nobles had stored grain, but even they couldn't hoard forever. Some used their reserves to control entire regions, demanding loyalty in exchange for food. Others tried to flee to areas where the drought hadn't hit as hard, only to find themselves unwelcome outsiders in foreign lands. Disease thrived in these conditions. Malnourished bodies had no resistance to sickness. Dysentery, typhus, and plague spread like wildfire through weakened populations. Even minor infections became deadly without proper nutrition or medicine. Entire villages were abandoned, left as ghost towns where only the wind moved between empty homes. With desperation came superstition. People searched for someone to blame. Was it God punishing them for sin? Was it witches poisoning the wells? Accusations flew faster than facts. Trials began. Punishments followed. In some places, entire groups were scapegoated and driven out, or worse. Churches filled with desperate prayers. Priests led processions, carrying relics and holy icons in hopes of divine mercy. Pilgrimages to sacred sites increased, as people believed saints might intercede with God to send rain. Yet the skies remained clear, and the ground continued to crack. Governments struggled to respond. Kings issued decrees limiting grain exports, hoping to keep food within their borders. Some ordered emergency imports, but transportation was slow and unreliable. Roads were dangerous, and bandits preyed on supply caravans, knowing that anyone guarding food would be hungry and weak. In extreme cases, entire regions collapsed under the weight of drought. Populations shrank, trade routes shifted, and power structures changed. Some kingdoms fell, while others rose from the ashes, built on the ruins of those who couldn't adapt. But through all this, one truth remained. When the rains finally returned, the scars of drought lingered long after the clouds passed. In a world without satellites, weather forecasts, or scientific explanations, drought was more than just a natural disaster. It was a divine punishment. For medieval people, everything had a spiritual cause. If the rains didn't come, it wasn't because of climate patterns, it was because God was angry. Or worse, because someone in the village had sinned and brought down divine wrath upon them all. Churches became the heart of the response. Priests led daily prayers for rain, often holding special masses dedicated to saints believed to have control over the skies. Saint Michael the Archangel, protector of justice, was frequently invoked. So was Saint Isidore of Seville, the patron saint of farmers, whose intercession was thought to bring life-giving water. Processions were common. Entire villages would gather, walking barefoot through the dusty fields, carrying relics, icons, and crosses. They sang hymns and chanted litanies, hoping their devotion would move heaven to pity. In some places, children were chosen to lead these processions, believed to be purer and closer to God. Pilgrimages surged during times of drought. People traveled for miles to holy sites, offering gifts, lighting candles, and praying at shrines. Some walked on their knees as acts of penance, believing that suffering would show their sincerity and force God's hand. But not all religious responses were peaceful. When prayers failed and the sky remained clear, desperation turned to fear. Some began to believe that drought was not only a punishment, but a sign of hidden evil among them. Witch hunts increased. Accusations flew like sparks in dry grass. Women, especially those who live alone or were seen as strange, were blamed for drying up the land with their black magic. Trials followed, confessions were extracted under torture, and executions took place, all in the name of ending the drought. There were even rituals designed specifically to force rain. One involved burying a statue of a saint upside down in a field, symbolizing the inversion of nature and the need for divine correction. Another required villagers to whip themselves while marching through town, a practice known as flagellation, meant to prove their repentance. Religion was both a source of hope and a weapon of fear. It gave people something to do when they felt powerless, but it also turned neighbor against neighbor in times of crisis. Through faith, superstition, and sheer desperation, medieval societies tried to wrest control from the heavens, hoping that one day the clouds would finally break and the long-awaited rain would fall. Floods were the opposite of drought, but just as deadly. Where drought left the land cracked and lifeless, floods came with fury, swallowing homes, drowning livestock, and turning roads into rivers of mud. In the Middle Ages, without modern flood barriers or weather warnings, people had little time to prepare when the skies opened up. Seasonal rains, melting snow, and overflowing rivers could transform entire regions into vast, impassable wetlands. Villages built near rivers for easy access to water suddenly found themselves underwater, their homes swept away by relentless currents. The impact was immediate and devastating. Crops drowned in fields before they could be harvested. Stored grain rotted in damp cellars. Livestock either drowned or became sick from standing in flooded pens. Bridges collapsed under rushing waters, cutting off towns from supplies and aid. Roads turned into swamps, making travel nearly impossible and delaying any relief efforts. Cities suffered even more. Drainage systems were primitive at best, and heavy rain would cause streets to become torrents of filth. Sewage mixed with floodwaters, spreading disease through contaminated drinking sources. The stench of soaked garbage and human waste filled the air, creating a breeding ground for illness. Medieval Europe experienced many such disasters. In 1315, the Great Famine began with months of continuous rain that ruined crops across the continent. Fields became lakes. Starvation followed. The same cycle repeated itself throughout the centuries, each flood leaving behind death, poverty, and despair. But unlike drought, which crept in slowly, floods arrived with force. People had to act fast, move to higher ground, save what they could, or risk losing everything. Some communities built dikes and raised their homes on stilts, while others simply prayed for the waters to recede. Floods reshaped landscapes, destroyed livelihoods, and tested the limits of medieval resilience. They were nature's reminder that too much water could be just as deadly as none at all. Floods didn't just come out of nowhere. They were the result of a deadly mix between nature and human limitations. The most common cause was heavy seasonal rainfall. In many parts of Europe, winters brought relentless storms that soaked the land for weeks. Without modern drainage systems, water had nowhere to go. Rivers swelled, overflowed their banks, and turned entire regions into lakes overnight. Snowmelt also played a role. In mountainous areas like the Alps or the Pyrenees, winter snow built up over months. When spring arrived, the sudden thaw sent torrents of water rushing down valleys. Villages downstream had little warning before floodwaters crashed through their homes. But not all floods were natural. Human error and poor planning made things worse. Medieval cities were built with narrow streets and tightly packed wooden buildings, perfect for spreading fire, but terrible for managing water. Drainage was almost non-existent. Gutters and sewers were primitive at best, often clogged with trash, animal waste, and even dead bodies. Deforestation made flooding more severe. As forests were cleared for farmland and fuel, there were fewer trees to absorb rainwater. The soil became compacted and unable to soak up moisture, causing runoff to rush straight into rivers and streams. In some cases, people caused floods themselves, accidentally or on purpose. During wars, armies would destroy dams or levees to flood enemy territory. This tactic turned battlefields into drowning zones and left civilian lands underwater for years. Even minor weather events could become disasters because of how people lived. Many villages were built near rivers for easy access to water and trade routes. But when those rivers rose, escape was difficult. There were no early warning systems, no emergency response teams, just panic, chaos, and rising water. And once the flood came, there was no stopping it. When floodwaters surged through villages and cities, there was no time to plan, only time to act. The first priority was survival. As rivers burst their banks and rain fell in relentless sheets, people scrambled to higher ground. Entire families climbed onto rooftops or fled to nearby hills, carrying what little they could. Children, a few belongings, maybe a sack of grain or a pot for cooking. In towns and cities, the wealthy retreated to upper floors or stone buildings that could withstand the rising water. Peasants weren't so lucky. Many were forced to wade through waist-deep water, searching desperately for shelter. Some clung to wooden beams or makeshift rafts, hoping the waters wouldn't sweep them away. Communities came together in times of crisis. Neighbors helped neighbors carry food and tools to safety. In some places, churches opened their doors to the displaced, offering temporary refuge from the storm. Monks and priests often played a key role in organizing aid, distributing what supplies they had and comforting the frightened. Emergency repairs began almost immediately. Villagers used sandbags, straw bales, and wooden planks to try to hold back the water. Dikes were reinforced with whatever materials were available, sometimes even furniture and farm tools. In larger cities, city officials dispatched workers to clear blocked drains and break down barriers trapping water in streets. Food and clean water became urgent concerns. With crops drowned and stored grain ruined by moisture, hunger loomed. People relied on reserves kept in elevated granaries or shared what little they had. In flooded cities, where sewage mixed with drinking water, disease threatened to kill more than the flood itself. Boiling water over open fires became common practice, though not always enough to prevent outbreaks of illness. Animals were another worry. Cattle, sheep, and horses either drowned or stood knee-deep in mud, vulnerable to sickness. Farmers tried to move them to dry land, but many perished. Losing livestock meant losing not just food, but also labor and transportation, devastating losses in a world already stretched thin. As the waters slowly receded, the true scale of the destruction became clear. Homes lay in ruins. Roads were washed away. Bridges collapsed into swollen rivers. The work of rebuilding had to begin before the next storm arrived. Floods brought chaos, but they also brought resilience. Medieval societies didn't have modern technology, but they had something just as powerful: the will to survive. When floods became a recurring nightmare, medieval societies didn't just endure, they adapted. Survival meant learning from each disaster and building smarter for the future. Over time, communities developed long-term strategies to protect themselves from nature's wrath. These weren't high-tech solutions, but they were clever and often surprisingly effective. One of the most common adaptations was the construction of dikes and levees. In flood-prone regions like the Netherlands and parts of Germany, people began building earthen walls to hold back rising waters. These barriers were made from soil, stone, and wood, reinforced with brushwood or sod to prevent erosion. Some towns even built canals and drainage ditches to redirect excess water away from homes and farmland. In cities, planners started raising street levels. After repeated floods, some urban centers simply added layers of dirt and stone on top of old roads, creating elevated pathways that stay dry during heavy rains. This practice is why archaeologists today can dig beneath modern European streets and find entire medieval neighborhoods buried underground. Homes and buildings also evolved. In areas where flooding was frequent, people began constructing houses on raised platforms or stilts, especially in marshy regions like parts of England and France. These structures allowed water to pass underneath without destroying the home entirely. Others used water-resistant materials, such as thickly mortared stone or raised wooden floors, to minimize damage. Some villages relocated altogether. When a river changed course or a region flooded too often, entire communities picked up and moved to higher ground. These new settlements were often built on hillsides or near natural ridges, offering both protection and a strategic advantage. Agriculture had to adapt too. Farmers learned to plant flood-tolerant crops like certain types of barley and rye, which could survive short periods of submersion. They also developed raised field systems, known as warping fields, where crops grew on elevated mounds surrounded by shallow channels that absorbed excess water. In monastic communities, monks played a key role in flood management. Many religious orders became experts in land drainage and irrigation, using their knowledge to build sophisticated water systems around their abbeys. These included overflow ponds, controlled sluice gates, and artificial wetlands designed to absorb floodwaters before they reached populated areas. Despite all these efforts, floods remained a constant threat. But through trial, error, and sheer determination, medieval societies found ways not just to survive, but to rebuild, stronger and smarter than before. Floods didn't just destroy homes, they shattered economies, displaced entire communities, and left lasting scars on medieval society. When floodwaters receded, what remained was often unrecognizable. Fields once filled with crops were now barren mud pits. Livestock drowned or starved, leaving farmers without food or income. Roads and bridges were washed away, cutting off trade routes and isolating towns from vital supplies. In cities, markets collapsed as stored grain rotted and goods became scarce. Prices soared overnight, and hunger followed closely behind. The poor suffered the most. With no insurance or government aid, peasants had to rebuild with whatever resources they had, which was often nothing. Some lost everything: homes, tools, livestock, and even family members. Without shelter or work, many were forced to migrate in search of better conditions, swelling the populations of already struggling towns and creating overcrowded slums. Wealthy landowners fared slightly better but still faced ruin. Flooded estates meant ruined harvests, leading to lost income and unpaid laborers. Lords who relied on tenant farmers suddenly found themselves with empty coffers and angry tenants demanding relief. Some responded by lowering rents temporarily, while others raised them, pushing desperate families into deeper poverty or forcing them into debt bondage. Trade ground to a halt. With roads turned to swamps and rivers too dangerous to cross, merchants couldn't transport goods. Towns that depended on imported food or materials faced shortages, and prices for basic necessities skyrocketed. Artisans and craftsmen found themselves without raw materials or customers, forcing many out of business. Cities bore the brunt of economic collapse. Tax revenues dropped as businesses failed and residents fled. Governments struggled to maintain order as desperation led to theft, riots, and violence. In some places, authorities imposed price controls to prevent hoarding, but enforcement was difficult and often ignored by those profiting from the crisis. Disease further deepened the crisis. Contaminated water spread sickness rapidly through weakened populations. Dysentery, typhoid, and respiratory infections thrived in damp, crowded conditions. With malnutrition widespread, even minor illnesses became deadly. Hospitals, if they existed at all, were overwhelmed, and monks or local healers could do little more than offer comfort. Social structures also shifted. In times of disaster, old hierarchies sometimes broke down. Peasants who had lost their lands sought work elsewhere, sometimes negotiating better terms with new lords. In some cases, this led to greater mobility and small gains in power for the lower classes. But in other regions, nobles used the chaos to tighten control, imposing harsher rules and punishments to maintain order. Communities that survived floods often came together in ways they hadn't before. Neighbors shared food, rebuilt homes side by side, and formed stronger bonds in the face of shared hardship. Religious institutions played a key role in distributing aid, reinforcing their influence over daily life. Yet despite these moments of unity, the long-term damage was immense. Recovery could take years. Some villages never fully bounced back. Abandoned homes stood as silent reminders of lives lost, and fields once full of promise remained fallow long after the waters had gone. Floods didn't just change landscapes. They changed lives, reshaping societies in ways that echoed for generations. When the waters finally receded and the devastation became clear, one truth remained: no one could rebuild alone. Floods left behind more than ruined homes and drowned fields. They shattered entire ways of life. But medieval communities were not helpless. In the face of destruction, people relied on each other in ways that modern society often forgets. The first step after a flood was survival. Those who had lost everything depended on neighbors who still had shelter or food. In many villages, those with dry homes opened their doors to the displaced, sharing limited resources until the crisis passed. Wealthier landowners sometimes offered temporary housing or supplies, though often in exchange for future labor or loyalty. Rebuilding began almost immediately. With no emergency services or government aid, communities organized themselves. Men worked together to clear debris, repair damaged houses, and restore farmland. Women cooked, cared for the sick, and helped maintain order. Children gathered materials or ran messages between families. Every member of the village played a role, no matter how small. In some places, religious institutions took the lead. Monasteries and churches often acted as centers of relief, offering food, shelter, and spiritual comfort. Monks and priests distributed stored grain and organized rebuilding efforts. They also recorded flood damage and recovery attempts, giving us valuable historical insight into how these events unfolded. Mutual aid was key. Villagers shared tools, animals, and seeds so that farming could resume as soon as possible. If one farmer's plow was destroyed, another would lend theirs until a new one could be made. In larger towns, guilds, early forms of professional associations, stepped in to support members who had lost their workshops or goods. Trust was essential. After a disaster, debts were often forgiven or postponed. Landlords reduced rents. Lenders canceled loans. These weren't acts of charity alone. They were practical decisions. A community that collapsed under debt and despair could not recover. Helping others ensured everyone's survival. Sometimes cooperation extended beyond local borders. Neighboring villages sent aid when they could, sending extra grain or workers to help rebuild. In rare cases, even distant rulers responded by sending supplies or issuing tax breaks to flood-affected regions. Though slow and inconsistent, these gestures showed that medieval societies understood the value of collective resilience. But perhaps the most powerful tool in recovery was memory. Survivors passed down lessons learned from each flood: where to build safer homes, which crops to plant, how to reinforce dikes. These oral histories became lifelines for future generations facing the same threats. Floods could wash away homes, roads, and livelihoods, but they couldn't erase the strength of a united community. Floods and droughts were more than just natural disasters. They were defining forces of medieval life. These extremes tested the limits of human endurance, reshaping communities, economies, and even belief systems. Yet, despite the devastation, people found ways to survive. They built dikes, stored grain, prayed for rain, and rebuilt their homes with their own hands. They shared resources, supported one another, and passed down knowledge that helped future generations prepare for the next disaster. The resilience of medieval societies was remarkable. Without modern science or technology, they relied on observation, tradition, and cooperation to endure nature's fury. Their solutions may seem primitive by today's standards, but many laid the groundwork for the flood management systems and agricultural techniques we still use. And while we now have weather forecasts, irrigation, and emergency aid, the fundamental challenges remain the same. Climate change is bringing more frequent and severe droughts and floods across the world. In many ways, we are facing the same battles as our ancestors. Only now, we have the advantage of history. We can learn from the past. We can see how vulnerable societies responded when nature turned against them. We can understand the importance of preparedness, community support, and adaptation. And most importantly, we can appreciate how far we've come, while recognizing how much we still stand to lose if we ignore the lessons of history. So next time you turn on a tap and clean water flows out, or step into an air-conditioned room during a heat wave, remember, not so long ago, survival depended on nothing more than hope, hard work, and sheer determination. If you want to keep discovering these hidden stories from past, the brutal truths, the forgotten struggles, and the surprising wisdom of those who came before us, hit that subscribe button. Because history isn't just about kings and battles. It's about survival. It's about us. Floods and droughts were just the beginning. If you thought that was intense, wait until you dive deeper into the brutal, bizarre, and often horrifying realities of medieval life. Imagine a world where going to the bathroom meant throwing waste out your window, where healthcare consisted of leeches, bloodletting, and hoping for the best, where justice meant being thrown into water to see if you'd float, and if you did, you were executed for witchcraft. And that's before we even talk about the food. This was everyday life for millions of people. No exaggeration, no Hollywood gloss. Just raw, unfiltered survival in one of history's toughest eras. If you want to keep uncovering the shocking truths behind the Middle Ages, the violence, the superstition, the insane punishments, and the weirdly clever ways people survived, then hit that subscribe button. Because history isn't about knights and castles. It's about what it really meant to be human, long before modern comforts made us forget how brutal life used to be. See you in the next video, if you dare.